Hi everybody, this is Ben Cotton from The Captain's Coffee at thecaptainscoffee.com, and I get questions all the time about how to brew coffee the best way. What are some ways to improve the coffee in the cup that you get, kind of regardless of what the brew method is, because everybody uses a different method, and honestly there are thousands of videos and tutorials and articles out there on the internet about specific ways to do to brew coffee in specific brewing devices. But what I really rarely ever see is a discussion about the general principles of how brewing coffee works and what kind of basic foundational understanding of how to brew great coffee. Because honestly, if you understand the basics, then you can use any brew method and you can get the most out of that method and really capitalize on the strengths and minimize the weaknesses of that device. Okay, so there are 5 principles. I'm going to give you 5 things to think about. But first you need to understand with all 5 of these things, the idea with brewing coffee is that you're actually dissolving the coffee particles in water. And what happens with coffee is at the beginning of the extraction process or the dissolving process, you're getting out of the coffee, dissolving into the water all the good tasting stuff, okay? The oils and the sugars in the coffee are getting extracted into the water, and that's what makes coffee taste good. After a period of time, you begin to dissolve the bitter stuff, the stuff that doesn't taste good in the coffee. And so that's why we talk about over extraction. What's happened is you've extracted all the good tasting particles in the coffee, and you've begun to get some of the stuff that you don't want to taste, which is why your coffee tastes bitter a lot of times. There's a specific flavor to coffee that's over extracted that has actually nothing to do with the bean or with how you roasted it, and has everything to do with brewing. So we're going to talk about 5 things. The first is the turbidity, which is just a scientific word for the motion or the flow of water. If you move the water around, that's turbidity. The second thing is heat. Number 3 is the surface area of the coffee. Number 4 is time. And the 5th thing is dosing. So let's talk about each one of these really quickly. Okay, number 1 is turbidity, or the motion of the water. This has to do with if you stir the water or there's motion to the water. There are actually brewing devices now that I've seen come out in the last year or two that actually inject water into or actually inject air into the water as it's brewing, causing it to bubble and to flow, which actually affects how quickly the coffee flavor is extracted out of the coffee. It's not really common, but sometimes with certain brew methods like a pour over or even the AeroPress, stirring the coffee before you press the AeroPress, or maybe stirring the coffee in your, if you have a drip brewer that's actually not a very good quality brewer. Maybe you picked up a Mr. Coffee at Walmart and you're trying to get better flavor out of your coffee. You can try during the brewing process, stirring the bed of coffee to see if you can get more flavor out of your beans. That's one way to do that. Turbidity is not talked about that much with brewing, but it does affect it. Number 2 is heat. This one is a little more obvious. Heat, the higher the temperature, the faster the dissolving of the coffee particles. Now with coffee, there's a very specific range of temperature that's best for extraction with coffee. And that's basically 200 degrees, give or take about 5 degrees on the top or the low end. So 195 to 205 is generally the range you want to shoot for. With that, if you go too hot, you're going to actually burn and scald the coffee, which gives it kind of a burned, over-extracted taste that's not very good. If it's too low, you don't get the flavor out of the coffee that you want. And actually, with most of the readily available commercial drip coffee makers, do not get the coffee nearly to that temperature. This is really the big dividing line between your cheap coffee makers, drip coffee makers, and your more expensive ones. If you go to, in fact, if you're shopping for a drip coffee maker, I wouldn't even go to a big box store to get one. I'd go online to do that. But if you do, go to a Walmart or one of those kinds of places with appliance stores, look for brewers that get the temperature up to 200 degrees. If you can find one, that's your best bet. Number 3 is surface area, which really has to do with the size of the grind. And this one is hard for a lot of people to understand when we talk about surface area, but if you imagine your sugar cube in your hot water, if you break up that sugar cube into smaller pieces, it's going to dissolve faster and more evenly. The same thing is true for coffee. When you grind the coffee, it's going to extract flavor more easily and more evenly across the bed of coffee. And one of the things to remember is that the finer the grind, the greater the surface area, okay? So the finer you grind your coffee, the more quickly it's going to extract. Now that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on the brew method and the flavor you're going for. Sometimes you actually, with a drip brewer, you actually do better, get a better coffee in the cup is if you do a more coarse grind and maybe a longer extraction, because you really can't control very much the time that it takes to brew your coffee in a drip brewer. What you can control is the grind and the dose, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But the grind, sometimes you get a better flavor if you slow the extraction down a little bit by doing a more coarse grind and maybe upping the dose. So more coffee grounds at a more coarse grind can actually sometimes give you a much better flavor, especially in like a more automatic brew method like a drip brewer that may not be hot enough, or you can't control things like the time it takes to brew. So surface area, the grind is a huge thing. This is why you need a really good grinder. This is the reason, is that you can control the grind size, which means you can control the flavor of your coffee. Really the grind combined with the dose, those two things together will help you more than anything else, especially with kind of harder, more difficult brewing devices like a cheap automatic drip maker, which most of you probably have right now and are struggling to get the best cup out of it. And getting a good grinder and playing around with the grind level, maybe going finer. Most people with the rotary blade grinders are grinding way too fine. They're creating a powder, and then they put the coffee in the machine, and the cup is really bitter, over-extracted. The reason for that really is the grind is too fine. Number 4 is time. This one's pretty obvious. The longer your sugar cube is in the hot water, the more it's going to dissolve. And this one really, if you can control how long the water is in contact with the coffee grounds, this is a variable you can play with quite a bit. So things like a French press, even AeroPress, pour over. Pour over is a little more difficult to control the time on. But when you're talking about steep time, especially with a soaking brew method like the French press, you can play around with how long the coffee sits in the water and get different extraction rates, which means you can really control the flavor. And so time is a huge factor, but a lot of brew methods don't allow you to change that, especially drip makers. It's one of the reasons people choose manual brew methods, is that they can control the time that the water is in contact with the coffee and thereby control the extraction rate. And last one is number 5, dosing, which is probably one of the most heavily debated aspects of brewing when you're talking about brew methods. Everybody's got a different dose they use for their drip maker, different doses that they argue about for AeroPress and espresso and everything. Everybody's got opinions about this one. But what you need to know is really the more coffee that you have in your brewing, the more flavor you will get out of it, to a point. If you overdose it, you'll get bitterness because the ratio is off. If you underdose it, you get very weak coffee. And so much of dosing is very much a personal preference. In drip brewing, I tend to dose it pretty high. If I'm doing let's say it's a 8-cup brewer, and I'm gonna make a full pot, so that's 8 cups, eight coffee cups of coffee. I'm gonna pretty much get as much coffee in that basket as will fit without it spilling over. That's how I like to do it. And then I will control extraction using the grind and not the dose, because I find that I'm packing more flavor into the cup when I dose it really high with a drip brewer. And then if it's over extracted, I just make the grind a little more coarse until it's just right for me. And that's how I do most of my drip brewing. Now, it means I'm using a lot more coffee, but I'm getting my coffee for free. And so to me, that's the best way to do drip. Now, that doesn't apply to all brew methods. Some brew methods do, like the AeroPress, I use less coffee. I'll use maybe 19 grams of coffee, which is if you use the AeroPress scoop, that's about 1.5 scoops. And then I will fill up the chamber with hot water and let it steep for a minute, which is not, instead of just plunging it immediately. So there you can see I'm using less coffee at a fine grind, more water, but also more time than what is typically done with an AeroPress. And so playing around with those variables, I can control the flavor in the cup using that. So dosing is a big element, especially if you've got, like I said, an automatic drip brewer where you can't control some of these variables. Look at the ones that you can control, like dosing, grind, and play around with those variables as much as you can to get the best flavor out of the cup. Here's the final idea here, which is to look at whatever brew method you're using right now in your kitchen to make your coffee, even if it's the cheapest, Mr. Coffee Maker that you could find at the Goodwill store. Whatever it is, look at the variables that you can control. It may be all 5 of these, which are, to review, turbidity, heat, surface area, and time, and dosing. 5 things. If you can control 1 or 2 of those, or maybe, even if you don't have control over any of those, maybe work towards buying a nice grinder or something like that, to where you can control more variables. The more control you have over the brew and over those variables, the better the cup's going to be in the end. And so take your brew method, whatever it is, and start to experiment. And the way you can do that is take notes. So have fun with it. Take a Saturday afternoon and take your cheap drip coffee maker that you're ready to throw out. Actually, if you can throw it out and get a better one, do it. But if you can't afford that, just take what you've got and then experiment with it. Change 1 variable at a time. So maybe raise the dose of the coffee in the basket and try it. Take some notes about what it tastes like, take some notes about what you changed, and then adjust the grind. And then see how that affects the flavor and make adjustments, taking notes until you dial in that brewed method, that device to get the best coffee that you can out of it. And this applies to every brew method, from espresso, pour over, AeroPress, French press, and everything in between. Play around with these variables, but do them 1 at a time so that you can pinpoint what the changes are that you like and the ones that you don't like. So enjoy that. Let us know what you think. Try these things out. If you need help, advice with any of this, you can comment or email us and ask questions. You can go to thecaptainscoffee.com and send us an email or put comments there, or on our YouTube page or on Facebook, and ask your questions. I'd be glad to help you out. Good luck.